How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to Mojo Group. Mike here. Another video today. I know it's been a while, but I promise I'll make a full-blown video where I explain what's going on my end. But today I want to talk about recent events. As some of you may already know, we had yet another tragedy with a PC-12 crash, but more importantly, relating to the autopilot. And it seems that there's been more crashes, at least that I've observed these last couple of years, or even the last year, relating to the autopilot system. And for someone who, I would say, half of my career as a pilot, the last 6 years, I would say 100% of my mission, I'm using the autopilot, because most of my flights are cross-country flights, and I generally use my autopilot on those flights. So I know a thing or two about how to operate the aircraft with the autopilot on and with the autopilot off. Today's video, I'm not going to dissect the accident itself. One, because there's still reports coming out, and rest in peace to all of the souls lost on this particular flight. There's been others which we'll touch on, because I want to use this video to, in a way, educate us on how to use the autopilot, how I use the autopilot. So full disclaimer, I'm not a CFI. I'm just going to share my opinion on some of the safety points and practices that I use whenever I fly with the autopilot on. We'll cover three main parts here. First, let's talk about the accident in question. So we have the PC-12, which happened recently, this is a few days ago. And before that, we also had a crash with a YouTube pilot, TN Fly Girl, rest in peace to Jenny. I believe her accident was also related to the usage of the autopilot. And I can recall an accident that happened back in 2008 or 2009. This was involving a Cirrus SR-22 and also autopilot related. As a matter of fact, I remember reading about that particular accident and using that accident as a way to form my habits towards using the autopilot. So those are the three accidents we're going to use as examples in this video. So what is the autopilot anyway? Autopilot is, you can consider it a safety tool, right? This is a tool that you have if you fly a fairly modern airplane. Chances are you have an autopilot, especially if the airplane is instrument rated or instrument equipped. You would have the autopilot system in that plane. And so consider it a safety tool and also a co-pilot. Keyword being co-pilot, because even when you use your autopilot, remember that you're still pilot in command. And if you want to break it down even further, consider your autopilot as a computer system that's connected to a bunch of pushing rods, connected to the control surfaces of the airplane. So whatever you as the pilot input into that computer, then it directs the autopilot to do XYZ, whether control your ailerons, your elevator, or your trim. That is your autopilot in a nutshell. And how you use it, when you use it, is extremely important. Now, let's take the most recent accident first, the PC-12. If you're not familiar, the PC-12 is a turboprop airplane, very sophisticated aircraft that is used for both private flying, and a lot of charter companies love to use this aircraft because it's been deemed safe, it's very versatile, and it can carry load. It's not the fastest aircraft in its class, but it gets the job done. And also it has one engine. A lot of commercial operations love the PC-12, which I'm not sure this particular flight was a commercial flight, but either way, it was flying some important people, as we've already found out. Now, during this flight, everything seemed to be going well, and about 2 hours or so into the flight, they were at 26,000 feet when the pilot reported that he was having some issues with his autopilot. Now you can ask yourself, well, if you're having trouble with the autopilot, why not just turn it off? Well, I can't really answer that question, but it's important to understand the flight rules as pertaining to this particular flight. Whenever you're flying VFR, you don't necessarily need or have autopilot. You don't need to use it, right? Because you can see outside and you can fly the plane yourself. But generally, when you have an IFR flight plan, autopilot is part of the package. You got to have one on board. And so I imagine at 26,000 feet, they were likely on an IFR plan. So the pilot reported that he was having trouble with the autopilot and that he had lost control of the aircraft. Again, I'm not sure what happened in that cockpit, but chances are if you're having trouble with your autopilot, you can always turn it off and hand fly the airplane. But when a pilot reports that they no longer have control over the aircraft, that is an emergency at all high level. So I'm gonna wait personally to get more report on this accident, but that's what was reported, that they were having trouble and pretty much everything went left after that. So how do you mitigate a situation like this from happening or protect yourself even in events like this happens? Whenever I use the autopilot, which again I use 100% of the time on my cross-country flights, the first thing I do before takeoff is test my autopilot as part of my takeoff checklist. Here's the thing, when you're flying a smaller piston engine airplane, chances are you don't have the check for your autopilot on your checklist. So you technically have to manually add it, right? So it's something you have to remember to do. And all you're doing is simple. You're checking, turn the autopilot on, check your control surfaces, right? You can change your heading and see if the autopilot moves right, or your control surface, the ailerons move right or left, vice versa. Check your pitch control for your elevator, and boom, you're good. But not all the way. Just because your autopilot seems to be good on the ground doesn't mean that it's not going to give you problems when you get up there. And guys, it will. I promise you, in all of my flights, I've always had something, right? Especially if I haven't flown in a while, when I get up there and I try to use the autopilot, sometimes it's giving me the wrong thing or the wrong thing that I wanted to do. And 9 out of 10 times, it was because of my error. Which brings me to the next accident report. So when you use your autopilot, when you use any tool in your avionics or any tool that controls your airplane or helps you fly that airplane, there's a chance that human error is going to play a factor, meaning you either may enter the wrong thing or you push the wrong thing in your flight plan. And when it comes to the autopilot, this happens more often than you think, especially when it comes to the pitch control of that airplane that you need your autopilot to help you with. If you don't set the altitude, or if you don't set how the airplane climbs or descend, or if you don't put, say, hold, right? There's a function where you can hold the altitude that you want the airplane to stay on when you're cruising. So if you don't have the right input into the system, the autopilot is just going to do whatever it is that it's reading. And so in my experience, when I've had trouble with the autopilot, 9 out of 10 times, it's because I needed to have the right input. Now, that doesn't mean that sometimes you won't have software issues, right? So also something to keep in mind is when you're using the autopilot, understand that it's also running with a software. So if your software is outdated, or say Garmin, which was the autopilot that I had, if they have some type of SB or service bulletin or notice out there that, hey, you need to upgrade the firmware to do this, or upgrade your software because we've had this common issue that pilots have reported, chances are your autopilot may give you some trouble, and it could just simply be because you have not updated the software. So keep that in mind. Just because you test that autopilot on the ground doesn't mean that it wouldn't give you trouble once you get up in the air. Now, the second most important thing in my experience is when you use the autopilot. As I've said many times on this channel before, as a pilot, you should always have your own minimums, have your own habits, good habits, right? Just because something is standard or just because this is the common practice doesn't mean that you always have to do that. And the reason I say that is this. When I use my autopilot, I generally don't turn that thing on until I get to cruise. That's just my personal minimums. Now, you have so many different pilots have a different behavior towards this. You have pilots who will turn the autopilot on shortly after takeoff. Some pilots wait till they start their climb, and boom, they turn it on. Some pilots decide not to use it at all. For me, I wait till I get to cruise altitude, which means takeoff, climb, I'm hand flying that airplane. But also, I'm your G8 pilot. In the commercial world, things are likely done differently, which brings me to the next accident report. So back in 2009, there was an accident with a Cirrus SR-22. This was a well-experienced pilot, instrument rated, and he was fairly new to the Cirrus airplane. But unfortunately, on an IFR flight plan, he crashed the plane shortly after takeoff. And so on this flight, it was questionable weather. So he was flying into IMC, which again, fine if you have the experience doing that. Filed IFR, and shortly after takeoff, he engaged the autopilot. And by shortly, I mean less than 10 seconds after takeoff, boom, turns the autopilot on. And just a few minutes into the flight, different things were happening, more to do with the altitude. So generally speaking, when you get a clearance for instrument, you would either get a clearance for say 3,000 feet, you get one altitude, and then once you get there, before you get there, they might change it and give you a higher until you get your desired altitude. So in this case, the pilot was given clearance to fly to a certain altitude, and the plane apparently got to an altitude and then dropped, descended to a lower altitude, and then again climbed, and then again banked. So weird things started to happen with this aircraft, and unfortunately that autopilot flew those two on board to their graves. After the fact, NTSB report shows that the pilot set the wrong altitude hold in the system. So when you use your autopilot, again, extremely important to always have the right input. But guess what? As a pilot, you also have to account for human error, which is why I say that when you use the autopilot is very important. Assuming this pilot took a different route and they decided to climb or get to a safer altitude and then use the autopilot, guess what? If the autopilot does something that they don't like, they can change it. Or they can look on their screen and say, oh wait, I have the wrong input here, let me change it. And that's essentially what happens with me. And I tell you, the first time I started to use the autopilot, there was a lot of learning curve for me. And that's why I wait till I have quite a few thousand feet under me. And that way I can practice. I can say, oh, this is what I want the airplane to do. If it's not doing this, then I need to correct it. And so in my opinion, I think it can be dangerous when you turn on your autopilot too early. And the last point I'll make about using your autopilot is know your exit plan. Right? Stay ahead of the airplane. This is something that your CFI generally will grill into you early on. At least that's what we grill into our students at Lookup Flight Academy, which by the way, if you're interested in getting your pilot's license or you want to build a career as a pilot, make sure you check out our flight school, newly open in Atlanta, Georgia. Check us out at lookupflightacademy.com. Come in for a tour. We'll take you up, check out the facility, check out the airplane. And my hope is that we can get you to the pilot seat at Delta. Okay, that's lookupflightacademy.com. All right, now back to safety. When you're flying, whether you're a student or you're a more advanced pilot, it's important to stay ahead of the airplane. More importantly, know your exit plan, right? Part of staying ahead of the airplane is, if this happens, what is my plan, right? Just like when you take a commercial flight, before takeoff, they always give you the exit plan for an emergency. So as a pilot in command, these are things that you think about before you even start your engine or before you take off, is if this happens, what is my exit strategy? Same thing with using your autopilot. The simplest exit strategy for the autopilot, turn it off. Turn it off. I have a 2-strike rule. Right? And again, this is why I wait to turn my autopilot on, because if something is going on that I don't like, I want to be able to check it, maybe play around with it, depending on how far up I am. And if the problem remains consistent, I just turn the autopilot off. Right? So as pilot in command, understand that you are that pilot in command. Even when you use your autopilot, autopilot is a co-pilot. It is not pilot in command. If that plane is doing something that you don't like, which as pilot in command, you should always pay attention to what your airplane is doing, even in IMC. Because if you get complacent and you get relaxed, then you're letting the plane fly you rather than you flying the airplane. So stay ahead of the plane, know what it is doing, and have an exit strategy. Honestly, this is one of the reasons why I love experimental planes, which I have a good bit of hours in. When I was building my airplane, I was very particular as to where I wanted the off button for my autopilot to be. It was right under my fingers, right? So whenever I'm using the autopilot, guess what? My hand remains on the stick. My hand remains on the power. That's just me. For other pilots, this is different. When I use that autopilot, I'm still holding on to the control surfaces of that airplane in case I need to make a change very quickly. And if I notice that my autopilot is doing something I don't like, all I'm doing is this. Turn it off and I take control back of the airplane. Or even something as simple as if I run into rough turbulence, which when you fly in the southeast, you can get bumped around quite a bit. If the turbulence is moderate to severe, I generally don't like to use my autopilot when there's turbulence. I prefer to just hand fly the airplane, even if I'm at 10,000 feet. So that's the last thing I will leave you with, right? As pilot in command, you have to have your own habits and your own checklist. Just because a tool is available to you doesn't mean that you wholeheartedly depend on that tool and not know how to get out of it should something happen. And so to reiterate, my 3 safety rules is check your autopilot, know when to use the autopilot, and my hope is that you choose to use it later into your flight, not early into your flight. And then lastly is stay ahead of the airplane, have an exit plan. If your autopilot is messing you up, just turn it off. Just turn it off. Okay, so that is my spiel. I'm sure there are other pilots who have different experiences and opinions about this, and I would love to hear it in the comment below. Okay, I want to promote safety as far as this is concerned, and rest in peace to all the souls lost. I hope that we can learn from these accidents and do better and actually create better habits for ourselves. Until then, guys, please fly safe, stay safe, and I will catch you on the next video. Peace.